The history of Irma, well, it goes back obviously to just before Labor Day. We were looking at the tracks of this slow-moving building storm out in the Atlantic. A couple of things happened there. We were looking at that and trying to determine what we would do because of the long weekend coming up. We wanted to make sure we got some word out to folks, but we also wanted to make sure we didn't have them coming in over the weekend and doing things that they didn't have to do in that time frame. So we put something out like the Thursday before saying the storm's out there, you need to be aware of it, start thinking about planning the next couple of days so we can come in on Tuesday and hit the ground running, which is essentially what we had to do. We got calls, our emergency management staff got calls from the State Division of Emergency Management. They're going to start their calls with the National Hurricane Center, which is a 2 times per day update for conditions around the state and reports and feedback from what's going on from the counties statewide, as well as reports from the National Hurricane Center. Those begin prior to the storm's approach, usually 2 times per day. They started those on Labor Day, so we were able to catch those on Labor Day. And Paul Womble and I get together on the phone and said, we better get our key staff together tomorrow morning. So first thing Tuesday morning, we had our key staff come in. We started looking at those kinds of planning things we need to get started in order to be able to do what we need to do when the time comes.
We began our normal notification processes over the weekend. And actually we began on that Monday, the holiday, to begin our coordination conference calls with the State Emergency Operations Center and the National Hurricane Center. And when we go into hurricane mode, we do those calls at least twice a day, find out what's going on from the state view, hear directly from the Hurricane Center, the forecast, advisories, what they think will happen. So that's really what began Irma, which is our normal process. So by Tuesday morning, we had our first official meeting here, where we brought in primarily our shelter partners, American Red Cross, Polk County Schools, Department of Health, Sheriff's Office, and the county divisions, the folks that make up our shelter program. And we laid out our strategy. That's the first thing we do to begin our hurricane readiness if we're going to activate. And all that's based off the Hurricane Center forecast. So we brought everyone together that Tuesday morning, used the graphics in the forecast to develop a timeline of when the storm would impact Polk County. And then we back up from there. We use that to determine when things need to happen. Shelter openings, EOC activation, everything else that comes along with a hurricane that we have to do here is based on that forecast timeline. So we bring our partners in. That's the job of emergency management, is to coordinate that response, bring everybody together, get the information, in this case, directly from the Hurricane Center, directly from the state EOC, talk to our neighboring counties. We have a coordinated response within the county, regionally with our partners. In this case, we had to know Irma came in from the south. So we needed to know what was going on in South Florida, because those evacuation orders and people leaving that area, especially in a very large storm that Irma ended up being, it caused the biggest evacuation in our history. So that impacts what we do here in Polk County. So we spend a lot of time on conference calls and factor that into our planning. So we brought the team in together, put everybody on alert, on standby to get ready to go on that Tuesday. So that gave us a few days as Irma progressed, continued to develop. And all along we had been watching what had happened in Texas just a few weeks before with Hurricane Harvey. There had been a lot of media interest, a lot of media attention on Texas. And what that caused here, when folks saw what could happen in a hurricane. And we started seeing phone calls early. We get lots of phone calls, especially for our special needs program, for people that are electrical dependent, they have some type of medical equipment, and then they need power or they need air conditioning, they need some support like that during an emergency. So our phones started ringing earlier than normal, and we call that the Harvey effect, because it really did have an impact on the response and recovery to Irma. So phones were ringing. We were bringing our stakeholders in. On Wednesday, we continued that process, updating our strategy, bringing in additional agencies, and the people that we need to run the EOC. And by Thursday, we were really ready to go. We had activated the EOC to a level 2 at that point.
Went to full activation Friday morning. Did a couple things for us. We tried to do pre-exercise or pre-hurricane season exercises and training so that when people come in here, they're ready to go. But again, you can't get everybody, and they don't do it frequently enough. So Friday gave us a day to kind of get those bugs worked out with systems, with setup, with people knowing where they're supposed to sit and what their arrangements would be, what their staffing would be for the period of time when we were activated. So that Friday we did work, but a lot of it was trying to get things prepared for the real show when things became very hot Saturday and Sunday. So Friday was kind of that day when we got things really prepared for the full activation. Saturday we began opening shelters, and we started to do things we need to do for pre-activate or pre-impact with the storm, and then to do what we had to do immediately post-impact.
Flooding, we knew that there would be a lot of rainfall with a very large storm, regardless of the exact path, the center, where those worst impacts would be because of how wide Irma was. The flooding forecast, 6, 8, 10 inches at least of rain. That certainly, we have areas around Polk County that flood. We've made a lot of great strides over the last, certainly 2 decades, going back to some of the areas in the past that flooded historically, but there's still, if we get a lot of rain in a short amount of time, areas are going to flood. So we prepare for that. Sandbags are distributed. We had a lot of demand for sandbags pre-storm, so that's a partnership with Polk County Roadway Maintenance and other agencies that are involved in that, and folks, Sheriff's Office, to get those out pre-storm. The National Weather Service issued an extreme wind warning for Polk County, which was the second time in the state of Florida's history that product had been issued. The first was when Irma made landfall in southwest Florida. What they told us when they issued that warning was we can expect 100-mile-per-hour plus winds throughout the county, basically a tornado moving through most of Polk County. Not just, normally tornadoes are very small. Irma really acted as a very large tornado as it moved through the county. Wind was the major hazard. Flooding, of course, we did have reports of flooding, but during the time of the storm, it really was a high wind event. And we saw that when we could go out and see in all the reports of trees down across the county, power lines down across the county, all the debris, all those things. So that was really, we compare our benchmark before Irma had been our 2004 hurricane season, certainly with Hurricane Charley. The majority of the impacts from Charley was on the east side of the county. There were countywide impacts, not like what we saw in Hurricane Irma. There truly was damage, debris, impacts countywide. So that makes a challenge to coordinate that response. Again, 2,000 square miles with a lot, 650,000 people that live in our county. We just don't have the resources to be able to automatically go out and touch every neighborhood, get the resources out. Luckily, there were some injuries. We were getting 911 calls. We know we ended up with 3 fatalities in the county post-storm that were related to the storm. But for the most part, our response initially was to get out in the communities, get reports from the cities, from all the other agencies, and begin that initial response, and then start planning out recovery efforts. So the storm made landfall in southwest Florida, moved through the middle of the state to our south. We started seeing hurricane conditions Sunday evening. Right around midnight from Sunday into Monday is when it really got bad here. And it took a few hours before it was safe for responders to be out. As soon as it was safe, then task forces with staff from Polk County Fire Rescue, Polk County Sheriff's Office, Polk County Roadway Maintenance, who had been pre-positioned. They were out surveying damage, clearing roads, really providing information back here to the EOC and back to those agencies about response issues and really helping us plan our initial response. We were able to get our first look on Monday morning, get pictures in. Took a little while in the Monday, I believe, before we were able to get anybody up in the air because it was safe for aircraft to fly, to get an aerial view of what had happened. And we realized right off the bat that there was a lot of debris, much more debris than we've had from the 3 storms in 2004, certainly more than any one of those storms. Debris operations are still going as of now, the early January 2018. Those should be wrapped up hopefully by the end of the month. So that means roads are blocked, critical facilities are blocked, shelters, government buildings. The other big impact was power outages. The power companies were reporting that by Monday morning that about 80% of the county was without electricity, which is a huge challenge. Traffic signals, government buildings, communication systems were somewhat impacted. And that makes us a challenge if we can't communicate with our email or telephone or cell phone, or those systems are impacted, our coordination response and our coordination efforts are harder. The county's public safety radio system stayed up, and that lets the responders talk, the EOC, the cities, everybody can talk on that radio system. That's a resource that we've had here for a long time, supported by the Board of County Commissioners, and it really pays off. That investment pays off in these type of situations. Same thing happened in 2004. The radio system stays up, designed to stay up, and then it lets us still communicate within the county with all the key agencies. So that's important. So power outages was a big impact throughout the county. When people can't when retail outlets are closed or impacted, we tell everybody they should be prepared for 3 days after an event, self-sufficient for 3 days with water and food and medicine and all those kind of things that you should have in your disaster kit. So we have to start planning for that. We knew with that large of a power outage, utility companies' estimates are typically, they overestimate just so they don't set expectations too high, which makes sense. So we were planning for at least a week to 2 weeks with some parts of the county not to have any power.
Power was, as it always is in an event like this, is kind of the backbone of your recovery. Until you can get power back restored, you're going to have situations where people are needing food, needing water, needing other means, or they can't stay in the house, or their house is not necessarily unlivable, but certainly difficult to live in. So the power companies became very, very important in trying to get that service provided back to the community. And again, a lot of the areas we found, especially in Duke Energy's power grid, and again, nothing against Duke, it just happened that they were impacted by the storm, probably more so as far as the recovery portion is concerned, because some of their power grid locations are in places that are difficult to get to, and they needed some supplies that they just couldn't get for a period of time. And the chain of getting those power from the power stations to the individual homes was a little bit more difficult in their areas than some of the others. So certainly they worked their best and worked as hard as they could to get those up. Just happened to be that eastern part of the county, Haines City and Frostproof and other places, where it's difficult to bring that power back up for a while. They probably are out more than most. But the purpose of the EOC is to coordinate those activities. We're not first responders. We're not people who are directing folks in the field per se. We are working with the people in the field, be it our first responders, again, the power companies, whoever, the shelters, whoever else is out there doing the work, getting them what they need. They need more food and water at the shelters. They need more equipment for the first responders. They need more equipment for our other folks. Our communities, our cities had their liaisons here getting inputs from them as to what they need, and we reach up our chain through the state to try to get those kinds of things. And that's the purpose of this center, and also to plan out to the future. We usually host the upper echelon leadership of the county in here during our activations, and during our discussions with that group, we determine what the long-range strategy will be for recovery, and obviously life safety meeting those first needs, but then we're going to distribute supplies and personnel and equipment for the best bang for our buck and get what we can do done as quickly as possible.
And people took it serious. They took the threat serious here in Florida, which is good, which is what should happen. You always want folks to take it serious. You don't want to overreact, but you want to be ready and then have a plan when the time comes, activate your family or your business disaster plan. So that's what happened. The other thing with Harvey that had impacted us here in Florida was resources from people, from agencies, Red Cross volunteers, FEMA staff, things like generators and fuel. All that had been sent to Texas to their response. So we knew going into Harvey that we would have resource challenges. A fundamental of emergency management is mutual aid. You get help from your neighbors, you get help from other jurisdictions, folks from all across the country. Well, that process had started for Texas. So all those resources were in Texas. So people had to shift. FEMA had to recall people, Red Cross had to recall people. State of Florida had sent staff, search and rescue, Florida fish and wildlife staff, those type of emergency responders, they were in Texas. So we had to get those back into the state to be able to respond to Irma. So that just was another challenge caused by Hurricane Harvey in Texas.
We were working with our people, our points of distribution folks from our leisure services and parks group that run that for us, to start looking at getting supplies, the supply train moving from the state, where they were going to send those supplies so they could help people get those in what we call our points of distribution or pods. Set up several of those around the county on Monday and Tuesday so we can get those lines going and get people in getting some food and some water. Had a lot of folks out doing damage assessments, teams doing actual damage assessments, taking down where the damages were, others doing just life safety type assessments to get our first responders and other crews out in the community to see where the damages were. A lot of it was back in areas that we had never seen damage before, really don't have a lot of folks. So we kept getting reports of damage throughout the week that from places and people who needed assistance from the impacts that we hadn't heard earlier on. It's just the nature of this particular storm and the layout geographically of Polk County. A lot of the areas, a lot of where people live is out in the wilderness area they like to live, but again, that makes it difficult for first responders and responding agencies like ourselves to try to get out there to help them.
We ended up dropping supplies in some of the smaller communities around the county. Again, further out, very large county, we have urban areas to very rural areas, and that makes it a challenge to get commodities out. And we don't have windows here in our building. We depend on reports from the public, from our partners, the cities, etc. So if we don't know there's an area that's impacted, it takes a little while for the those programs to get turned on, to get the resources in place, to get staffing in place. And that's why it's just super important for folks to have a plan and plan on at least 3 days of basically being on your own, self-sufficient. And that was demonstrated again in Irma with the power outages. I know once we were able to leave here to go out to see what was going on, right away we were getting reports that the retailers were running low on commodities. By the time we were able to actually leave here and go home, which for several of us, we spent several nights in the building, couldn't go home the one night, and then it just wasn't safe to go out. So stopped in retail establishment on my way home just to see what was there. The first night I went home and the shelves were just empty. All those products were gone. People had gotten them pre-storm, and then as soon as it was safe. And that's another issue with the power outages. If a retailer does not have power, they can't open their store, then there's just no way to get those commodities. So having folks to have a stash, a plan, a kit up front is super important. So the first few days, it was really about to find out what's happened, what are the impacts. The power outages cause challenges with traffic signals. When they go out, they have to be treated as a four-way stop. A lot of folks forget that or may not know that, or they're just not used to that. So that leads to safety issues. Power outages cause challenges with water systems, sewer systems, government facilities. Not every piece of infrastructure in the county has a backup generator to run it. So we had boil water notices. Folks were out of water, they couldn't flush. So again, that ties back to that preparedness piece, having a plan, having a disaster kit at home. Immediately after the storm, we have to do damage assessment, and that is based on what has happened. That's assessing infrastructure, that's assessing impacts to homes and businesses. And that process tells us several things. One, what do we need to do first? It opens the door to state and federal assistance. So within the first, really about the first 24 to 36 hours, as soon as it was safe, the cities and the county, the Polk County Building Division is the lead agency to coordinate damage assessment countywide, working with several other partners to really give us a snapshot. Here's what's happening in the cities, and starting to look at homes and businesses. FEMA has a damage criteria, and so that's where damaged category, major damage, minor damage. So we start looking at those numbers. We have to transmit those numbers and reports to the state and then on to FEMA. So by Tuesday, we had provided enough data, enough documentation to meet the criteria to be included in the Presidential Disaster Declaration. And that brings a whole host of federal programs. The Blue Roof program from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is tied to that declaration. So as soon as we were included in the declaration for Polk County, we requested that program to be turned on. We knew from the 2004 hurricane season that there would be lots of roof damage, and we were correct. As we drive around the county, we know folks are waiting weeks, if not months, to get roofing contractors repairs to their roof now. We set those folks up, worked with the Bartow Air Base in the city of Bartow to find them an office at the air base. And they were able to come in and get set up, and people were able to get registered for that program. The other part of that with emergency declarations from FEMA is their individual assistance program, which are the grants, all the federal programs to assist disaster survivors. So the first thing that happens there is once we're declared is we work to bring a disaster recovery center at the Stewart Center for FEMA to set up, and people could register on the phone. You have to register with FEMA. That's the first step in federal assistance. So we got the Stewart Center operational as a disaster recovery center, and the very first, that was the weekend after Irma, I think. The first weekend that the DRC was open, lines were out the door. People were lined up. The first few days we had to cut off registration because there were more people in line than the FEMA staff would have been able to process, to work through in a day. So that lasted for several days, then the numbers became more manageable. The DRC operated for several weeks. People were able to come and meet with the federal agencies to ask for assistance, get help with their cases, all those kind of things that go along into recovery.
We kept our shelters open probably through most of that week. I guess Wednesdays when we began to close our regular public shelters with the general population. We kept our special needs shelters open until the 22nd of the month, or sorry, the 19th of the month for special needs. We had some folks from general population shelters, just people who needed sheltering, in a shelter that the American Red Cross provided for us in Winter Haven.
So we set records with our sheltering for Hurricane Irma. Our 3 special needs shelters, we had over 1,300 people in those 3 special needs shelters. Because of the power outages, part of our planning early on was that we would need to keep those shelters open longer than what's normal, which we planned for several days anyway. And that's what happened in Irma. 2 of those special needs shelters are in schools that have emergency generators to be able to support life-saving equipment, oxygen-dependent medical equipment, et cetera, that has to have electricity. So we put a plan in place to transition those people that couldn't go home, who were still in those 2 school shelters, into the county facility in Bartow. That's our 3rd shelter, and that's what we did. We ended up transporting those folks thanks to Citrus Connection, who helped, along with Polk County Fire Rescue and private ambulance services on the front end of the storm. We were able to consolidate those folks down to the Bartow location, and so the schools could close as shelters and be able to start their process as clean up. We want to get the schools back to normal. That's one of the first things that we want to do, because that's really the first sign that recovery has begun if schools are able to reopen. Also, that for our public shelters, that strategy applied as well. We were able to, within just a day or so, folks were able to go home. The people from other areas that were here in the county, they didn't stay. Everybody made other arrangements, or they went home because they were able to go home. And the Red Cross was able to, or did have to open a post-storm shelter facility in Winter Haven. And that actually ran and operated for a couple of weeks post-storm because of damage and folks that were not able to go home. So they worked through that process. And our shelters were open longer than we had seen in 2004. We had more people than we had seen in 2004. And that just took a lot of effort, a lot of staff, county staff, volunteers, staff from all of our partner agencies to make that happen. So Irma is our new benchmark as far as sheltering here in the county.
We had a series of probably 10 functional group meetings in the post-disaster after-action report development role, and got all kinds of different information from them on what they saw, what worked well, what didn't work, how we can correct what didn't work, how we can build on what did work. Some great feedback came, and we're having actually in mid-January an after-action review of the final plan that we came up with, and try to move forward with corrective actions that we developed from those meetings. So I think, trying to capture from those boots on the ground folks or people here in the EOC what best we need to do to move forward and to learn from it, and then put that into training and other activities in the future is critical from where we go. So that's where the lessons learned will be put to the test.
We had tremendous support from Jim Freeman, the county manager, and the county senior staff, the Board of County Commissioners, our constitutional officers. Sheriff Judd was here, and his senior staff throughout. We had representatives, we had our senators, Agricultural Commissioner Putnam was here. He came here before the storm, came and saw us a couple of times. Just tremendous coordination and support from our elected officials. That doesn't happen in a lot of places, not to that level where all those senior leaders are in the room or on a conference call making decisions and working with us here and everybody in the EOC, and we appreciate their support.